Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 4 in our series on understanding transgenderism. If you've missed any of the first 3 parts, please check those out first. Links are in the description below. But if you're all caught up, then let's get right into it. When it comes to the question of how do we as Christians react to transgenderism, there really is another big question that we have to consider. As we talked about last time, faithfulness to God's Word and Scripture, it prevents us from adopting transgender philosophy as the best explanation for what people are going through, for boys who think they're girls, for girls who think they're boys. But our task doesn't stop there if we're going to really try to understand, because when we consider as Christians how we ought to understand what's happening, well, we have to consider alternative explanations for the very real experiences that people are going through. Like we talked about in part 1, it is a matter of understanding why something like transgender philosophy would be so compelling. What's behind that? What's the drive to embrace something like that? And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. Why would a boy think that he's a girl? Or why would a girl think that she's a boy? And there are really 2 categories of answer to this. The first one we're not going to spend that much time on, but that category is psychological issues, right? Transgenderism as a manifestation of mental illness, or one of several mental illnesses that are directly related to sexuality. And this is difficult. This is not a simple matter, right? There are diagnostic criteria, but so much of psychology is based on intelligent, educated guesses. Because you cannot open up a person's mind and look inside to see how it works the same way that you could open up a heart and see how it works, right? But there are a number of disorders that would be often associated with transgenderism. For example, autogynephilia would be one example. It's a disorder in which a man will experience sexual arousal at the image of himself as a woman. Obviously, that's a disorder of sexuality, though, of the way we think about it. Or there would be a gender identity disorder or a gender identity dysphoria. I forget which term is the more current one on that, but by way of analogy, there's another issue called body integrity dysphoria, right? It's where a person can come to believe that a part of their body isn't really their body, like they have this arm attached to them, but it's not their arm, or at least that's how they feel about it, right? It's an alien arm that's like somehow. Well, not alien is extraterrestrial, but it's an arm that doesn't belong there. It's not really their arm. It's not really their body part. And when it comes to gender dysphoria, it's very similar with respect to with the sex organs, sexual appearance, and those sorts of things. So that's one category of explanation of why would a person think this way? It's because they're mentally ill or more colloquially crazy. But that's the thing. I'm not going to talk about that category very much. And there are 4 good reasons why I'm not going to be talking about that. First is that I am not a psychiatrist. I do not have any real expertise in that area. Now, to be frank, I think that amputating a person's primary sex characteristics as a solution to those kinds of conditions, I think that'd be like deliberately cutting off the undesired arm of a person with body integrity dysphoria. Someday people are going to be looking back on the things that we're doing today the way that we look back on lobotomies, 40 years ago. Hey, this body part's causing trouble. Cut it off, throw it away. We don't really need it. Not really a great approach to the issue. But that said, it's not like I have anything good to offer with respect to, here's how you deal with that. It's not my training, it's not my expertise. Second reason why I'm not going to talk about this as a psychological disorder so much is that in as much as it affects the church, in as much as this intersects with Christian theology, the problem is not that people have mental illnesses. I'm not going to be having a video series on how should Christians understand people with broken legs anytime soon. Because the problem is the movement is not the fact of a disorder. Or an illness of any kind. The problem is the movement away from the sense that there is something wrong when it comes to transgenderism, in the medical sense, like something is wrong with a broken leg. It's not the way it's supposed to work. And the movement is instead towards saying that a boy who thinks that he's a girl is correct. He's healthy, completely normal, and should be completely affirmed in any way, and how dare you say otherwise. That's really where the movement is going there. That's what the transgender movement is demanding from people now. And that's really when it moves away from the medical issues, from the psychological issues, to the moral issues. And that's where it's judged by Christ's teaching, and that's really where we need to start talking about it as a church. Third, explicit mental illness does not really explain most of the transgender movement that we're seeing today. This is something that has been growing exponentially for the past decade or two, which is not normal for mental illness. It's presenting in very different ways than it used to. For example, transgenderism is affecting people whose psychological issues are far more mundane than something like autogynephilia, which is very, very unusual. Issues are much more mundane than would have been 20 years ago. People who experience things like depression and anxiety, or traumatic events like divorce or attempted rape or bullying, or simply having a poor ability to handle negative emotion, those are really run-of-the-mill, normal, everyday stuff for a lot of people. And it's looking more like that's more the issue for a lot of people than otherwise, and it's not so much the mental illness factor. For example, some researchers are starting to notice that transgenderism is acting as a kind of social contagion. In other words, that you're much more likely to identify as transgender when your friends adopt non-traditional identities. It's catching, if you want to use that term for it. For example, from one study, I'll put a link to this in the description below, or at least the article I read about it. A 14-year-old natal female, as in somebody who's born female, and 3 of her natal female friends were taking group lessons together with a very popular coach. The coach came out as transgender, and within 1 year, all 4 students announced that they were also transgender. Transgenderism is very rare, and the statistical likelihood of something like that happening is virtually non-existent. And in certain respects, transgenderism has become trendy. In one study, parents described intense group dynamics where friend groups praised and supported people who were transgender identified and ridiculed and maligned non-transgender people. Where popularity, status, and activities were known, 60.7% of the children with gender dysphoria in the study experienced an increased popularity within their friend group when they announced a transgender identification. And 60.0% of the friend groups were known to mock people who were not transgender or LGBTIA, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, or asexual. And that is not hard for me to believe at all. I have lost count of the number of times that I've been told that I shouldn't even be allowed to present my opinions in public because I am a white cishet male. So yeah, it's psychological issues aren't necessarily the best explanation for the bulk of the movement at this point. And the fourth reason I'm not really going to be speaking about the psychological aspects very much is that this is something that has become fanatically politicized. Doctors and researchers who actually broach the psychological question in the wrong way are at risk of losing their jobs or severely damaging their careers. I mean, in California and New Jersey, a doctor who even looks at the psychological history of a patient who claims to be transgender, they can lose their license to practice medicine just for looking at the health history of their patient. There are legitimate researchers who are seeing their studies scrubbed from the record when they don't match the narratives, the popular political narratives that we're seeing today. And things like these, those are not marks of open intellectual inquiry or a scientific approach to medicine, to say the very least. And unfortunately, the people who do have the serious mental illnesses are really being thrown to the wolves for the sake of politics very, very often. And we're going to talk about one example of that in a later video in this series. But, and I'm saying medicine and psychology, that's simply not what the movement has become about anymore. And that leads us to the category that we will be focusing on instead. And that is that it appears that for many people, transgenderism has become a kind of coping mechanism for various feelings of social alienation, rather than some kind of severe psychological issue. And because when you use that contemporary sense of the term gender that I talked about in part 2, that what it really comes down to is like, well, I don't identify with this gender, is that I don't fit the stereotypes. And there's nothing really new in that, because every time and place has had people who don't conform to the stereotypes. And I mean, that's why we have old-timey words like tomboy, right? It's a girl who tends to have more traditionally male interests growing up, right? And that's just part of the nature of generalizations. As soon as you make a generalization, you know that there are exceptions. As soon as you say that men are generally taller than women, you immediately know that some women are taller than men. And likewise, just as there are people there are always going to be people who don't fit the stereotypes, there are also people who aren't going to fit very well in with the wider culture, whether that's specifically related to their gender or not. There are a lot of people who simply don't fit in with their surrounding society and have a hard time fulfilling the normal expectations of that society. And whether that's their family, their class, other kids their age or peers, or their wider culture. Whether it's a wider culture, something large, or a subculture, something very, very small. A minority of people are always just not going to fit into that culture. And really, most people have some experience with this. All of us have had at least some small subculture that we've been a part of, but we don't really fit in with it. We're not really comfortable with the rest of it. Most people have had that experience to some extent. But for some people, that experience is much, much more pervasive than just, we've all felt that way sometimes. Some people feel that way almost all the time. And whether that's specifically related to their gender or not. The experience of when you don't really fit into most of the societies that you have been a part of. And there are lots of reasons from that. It can range from things like, being a different race or religion, or having a disability. Or, really, it can be something as simple as being ugly. That doesn't really get much traction when people talk about intersectionality. But let's face it, that plays a huge role in how successfully you socialize with other people. And for many people, it goes a lot further than just, we have trouble fitting in. It's more the idea that you can't fit in, that you feel like you're literally unable to fit in, no matter how hard you try. That there is no amount of effort or discipline that you could develop, that you could put in, that would fundamentally change your situation. On the contrary, for a lot of people, it seems that the more effort they put in, the worse it seems. And they don't really understand why. And that's when you really start feeling severely alienated from the people around you. And I don't think I've read a single account of a transgender's experience that didn't involve some significant sense of alienation prior to their transition. And some of the buried studies, again, they make that appear extremely common, as high as 90%. I've seen. And this for lots of different reasons. Everybody has their own history. Everybody has their own traumas, their own disabilities, or their own difficulties, or whatever form those take. And there is no single formula for this kind of alienation. But sometimes a severe social alienation does end up becoming associated with their sex or their gender for one reason or another. For example, and again, these are just examples. Any of them or none of them could apply for any individual. Everybody's a little bit different. But for example, a person might find that they feel much more comfortable around members of the opposite sex than they do around members of their own sex. Or maybe they find that their interests diverge from their own gender and conform more to the opposite gender. And very often this could include a kind of disgust with the idea of occupying traditional gender roles, for example, being a mother or being a father. Especially, if you have severe frustrations or even abuse from your own parents. Or sometimes it can result from overly rigid views of gender roles, like you have to be exactly this way. You can never really be exactly that way, and so you have trouble coping with that. Or maybe somebody finds that they are attracted to members of the same sex, and their way of coping with that is to consider themselves the opposite sex instead, basically as a way to, being transgender as a way to avoid being homosexual, or being labeled as homosexual anyway. Or maybe they idolize a member of the opposite sex and they want to try as hard as they can to be like that person, and they end up adopting the gendered traits of that person as well. Or maybe they have an extremely difficult time coping with changes during puberty. Because let's face it, I mean, puberty changes a child's life in very profound ways, and a lot of them are not received particularly positively, especially in today's culture. Because today we have this separate adolescent culture that's cut off from the other age groups. People are kept for decades sometimes in kind of this no man's land between childhood and adulthood, where you're not really an adult. You don't have the same expectations or responsibilities that adults have, but you're not a child either, and you're not content with being a child. But a lot of times people have a lot harder time getting out of that adolescent stage of life. Also today, puberty means that you suddenly have to confront the anarchy of contemporary sexual relationships without any real guidance from anyone. Puberty, suddenly it can throw you into this sexual free-for-all of sorts, and some people don't adapt to that particularly well. And the only guidance you receive is, everything's okay as long as you agree to it, but you don't really have a sound basis for whether you should or shouldn't agree to anything. Check out our series on rape culture if you want to understand a little bit more about that aspect. And sometimes a difficulty with puberty it includes a disgust with your own body and the changes that are happening there. You don't like the way that's changing, or you don't like the way other people are reacting to how your body's changing. I was reading the account of one woman who believes that she's really a man, and she felt as though her own body was betraying her during puberty because it kept becoming more and more feminine. But she didn't feel more and more feminine, and she didn't want to feel more and more feminine. And all of these kinds of experiences of alienation, they can be extremely painful. And when the alienation is painful, it just begs for an explanation. It begs for a solution. But there is that all-important distinction between your experience and your interpretation of that experience. And let's just walk through one example here. Let's say the experience of being more comfortable around opposite-sex peers than same-sex peers. And I'm choosing this one because that was generally the case for me growing up. I don't have the same kind of... some people would call this aggression. I think it would be more properly characterized as a kind of high-energy ambition. That's characteristic of a lot of young men. Girls back then, they would behave in a much more low-key manner, in comparison at least, which was a lot more comfortable. And there's also a mismatch of interests for me. I'm one of those people who I don't have an interest in sports, right? I have little interest in playing them, and I have almost zero interest in when it comes to watching them. So, and a lot of that is still true for me today. I mean, sports are still completely irrelevant for me. But on the other hand, I play Dance Dance Revolution, I'm an expert. And let's face it, that is a game designed for Japanese teenage girls. So what's the best explanation for all that, right? What's the best explanation for that experience? That maybe I really am a Japanese teenage girl? Or here's a much, much better explanation than that. I felt more comfortable around girls because I was never competing in a social hierarchy when I was with a group of girls. And that's one of the things about humanity. We always have social hierarchies, pecking orders, if you will. In any group of people, there's always going to be people who are more popular than other people in the group. It's the people who most of the people will look to for social trends. The people you would really rather have them like you than other people liking you. They're the people who end up deciding what movie you go to, or whatever the group happens to be about, And most people, we have these hierarchies, and most people navigate them fairly easily, without ever really realizing that that's even what they're doing. It just comes naturally. Whether they're at the top, the middle, the bottom of the hierarchy, they intuitively go through this kind of social dance when they're in their group of other people, and everybody, they kind of figure out their place, and they conform to their place for the most part. But not everybody does. It's not very easy for everybody. For example, for people who are on the mild end of the autism spectrum, well, if you're in that situation, you have difficulty processing social cues in real time. So managing those social situations, that's a lot harder for people in that situation. But here's the thing. Men and women, we have very different social hierarchies. The characteristics of popular guys and the characteristics of popular girls, they tend to be very, very different. The kind of guy that other guys look to is usually a pretty different kind of person than the kind of girl that other girls look to. I mean, they generally tend to be extroverted, but other than that, it's a lot of differences. And I'm saying when you're a man among men in a social setting, there's always this measure of everybody sorting themselves out into the ranks according to this social hierarchy. But if you're alienated, if you're experiencing a severe social alienation, you don't understand that process. And you don't really get the same sense from those social cues. You can't navigate the waters that everybody else is navigating, and you always feel lost. You always feel like everybody's doing this, and you never really understand why. And really, I mean, a lot of people will treat you very badly because you are not keeping up with that social dance. And that makes them uncomfortable as well, the fact that you're not keeping up. They don't know what to do with you any more than you really know what to do with them. But if you're a man among women in a social setting, that's a little bit different because there's no competition. You are outside the ranks. You are not competing with women for popularity. Because no matter how comfortable you may feel, you're never really just one of the girls. You're never really just one of the boys. Women generally do not compete with men for social standing among women. And men do not compete with women for social standing among men. Again, in mixed-sex groups, it's a little bit different. There's a much more complicated dynamic going on there. But in groups that are more men or mostly men or mostly women, that is different because men and women are different. And the social dynamics that work in one another's company are completely different. Women don't expect a man to behave like a woman, and men don't expect women to behave like men. So you're, in a sense, you are exempted from that pecking order, from that social hierarchy. And if you have trouble navigating that, well, that relieves a significant part of the social burden that you experience on a regular basis, because nobody's expecting you to fulfill those roles anymore. And that you feel more comfortable. That's the thing. I didn't feel more comfortable with the opposite gender because I belonged to it. I felt more comfortable precisely because I didn't belong to it and I didn't have to compete in that kind of social hierarchy. So that's a good explanation for why you might feel more comfortable with people of the opposite sex rather than the same sex. And I'm not saying that is, the explanation, right, for everybody who's ever felt that way, because it's not. Everybody's a little bit different. But what I will say is that it is a much, much better explanation for that experience than that someone who is really a woman who was born in a man's body, or vice versa. And really, it's interesting because there is a measurable difference for this when it comes to certain patterns of social alienation. People on the autism spectrum, again, they're 8 times more likely to identify as transgender. If you have ADHD, you are 7 times more likely to identify as transgender. And I'm saying the point of all this is that experience is not self-interpreting. There may be different reasons that you feel the way that you do. But when you confuse experience with interpretation, and you think that your experience is inviolable, and therefore your interpretation is inviolable, and nobody else is allowed to comment on it, nobody else is allowed to question it, well, then you can start going down some really, really deep rabbit holes. And you can overlook a lot of alternative explanations for what you may be going through. And you often do this by saying, oh, you don't understand, you don't know what it's like, without necessarily thinking critically about it yourself. But when you're suffering from severe alienation, whether you understand it or not, you've got to do something. I mean, that's what pain is for, right? The whole point of pain is to warn us of harm. And so the natural reaction to feeling pain is to try to get the pain to stop. And for alienated people, getting help from normal social support structures, well, that's a lot harder because you have less access to those social support structures. And So a lot of times what you end up with is people being very, very desperate. And desperate people are a lot more likely to start grasping at straws and start looking at bad explanations for what's going on. If you've ever seen a mirage, when the heat waves make it look like there's water on the ground. I saw a lot of those growing up because I lived in the Midwest. It gets hot. And I never found that particularly compelling. I never really looked at a mirage and thought, oh yeah, there's definitely water there. It was never really confusing. But if you're in a desert and you're out of water and you were dying of thirst, well, gosh, looking at a mirage then, that's a whole lot more compelling and a whole lot more understandable why people would be desperate to think, hey, maybe there really is finally water there. Maybe there I can finally find a solution to what's going on. And that is where we're going to stop for now. But be sure to join us next time, because we are going to consider some of the more constructive ways of dealing with social alienation, and why those ways are a lot harder now than they were even a generation or two ago.